Hi everyone. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us. Today we've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. I had always believed that providing for my family was my duty. I worked long hours, pushed myself beyond exhaustion, and sacrificed my own desires to ensure that my wife and our household had everything they needed. I never asked for much in return, just a little appreciation, a word of kindness, an acknowledgement that my efforts mattered. But that night I learned the brutal truth. My sacrifices were expected, not valued. It had been a grueling day at work, the weight of endless responsibilities pressed on my shoulders as I trudged through the front door. My wife sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, barely glancing at me. The house was spotless, the dinner smelled delicious, but something in me felt off. I was exhausted, not just physically but mentally, tired of carrying the entire burden alone. I sat down heavily beside her, rubbing my temples. Today was rough, I muttered, hoping for some sympathy. Without looking up, she sighed. You're supposed to provide, not complain. I froze, the words cut through me sharper than any knife. I turned to look at her, searching her face for any sign of regret, any hint that she hadn't meant it that way. But there was nothing, just the soft glow of her phone illuminating her indifferent expression. A slow realization crept over me, chilling me to my core. For years I had been killing myself to make sure she had everything, but in her eyes I was nothing more than a machine, a provider, not a person. My exhaustion, my struggles, my sacrifices, they didn't matter. My only role was to keep working and keep giving. Something inside me snapped, not in an explosive, angry way, but in a quiet, resolute shift. If I was just a provider, then what happened if I stopped providing? I stood up without another word and walked to the bedroom, my mind racing. That single sentence had shattered something deep inside me, something that could never be put back together the same way. For the first time I questioned everything, my role, my worth, and most of all the foundation of my marriage. If she only saw me as a provider, then I would remove myself from that role. No more sacrifices, no more breaking myself for someone who saw my efforts as mere obligation. The next morning I woke up feeling something I hadn't felt in years, clarity. The change was coming, and this time I wasn't looking back. If I was nothing more than a provider to her, then I would test what happened when that role was no longer my priority. Not out of anger, not in an effort to punish her, but to reclaim my own sense of self-worth. I started small. At breakfast she mentioned an upcoming spa day with her friends, one of her regular indulgences that I had always funded without question. Instead of my usual automatic, "Sure, take my card," I simply said, "I'm sure you'll figure something out." She blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" I shrugged, sipping my coffee. "I've decided to reevaluate my spending. I think it's time I focused more on savings and personal goals." There was an awkward pause, but she waved it off with a laugh. "Oh, come on. It's just a spa day. We can afford it." "Maybe, but I'm making some changes." Her laughter faded and she eyed me curiously, but I didn't elaborate. That was the moment the shift began. Over the following days, I gradually pulled back. I no longer picked up extra shifts at work. I stopped automatically covering every bill without a second thought. I didn't complain. I simply adjusted my behavior. When she asked about a weekend getaway she wanted to book, I responded with a nonchalant, "I don't think that's in my budget right now." She scoffed. "Your budget? You've never talked like this before. What's going on?" I met her gaze, steady and calm. I realized I've been so focused on providing that I forgot to prioritize myself. That's changing. For the first time, I saw something flicker across her face. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. The structures she had taken for granted was beginning to shift beneath her feet, and she wasn't sure how to handle it. At first, she acted as if nothing had changed, assuming this was some phase, but as the days stretched into weeks, reality set in. The spa days, the impromptu shopping sprees, the effortless luxuries, without my automatic financial support, they started to dwindle. She still hadn't apologized for what she said that night, and I wasn't waiting for it. This wasn't about revenge, it was about balance, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally regaining mine. At first, she acted as if nothing had changed. She still booked her usual beauty appointments, still filled online shopping carts, and still assumed that our lifestyle would continue as it always had, but the cracks in her illusion started to show when the credit card bills arrived and I wasn't the one paying them. "The card was declined today," she said one evening, standing in the doorway of our bedroom. Her voice was laced with confusion, maybe even irritation. I barely looked up from the book I was reading. "That's strange." "Yeah, strange," she echoed, waiting for me to offer a solution. When I didn't, she stepped further into the room. "Did you forget to pay it?" I turned a page. "No, I just didn't see the need to cover unnecessary expenses this month." The silence between us thickened. Unnecessary expenses. I finally met her gaze. The spa days, the designer handbags, the endless subscriptions. "They're not my priority anymore," her eyes narrowed. "Since when?" "Since I realized I was nothing more than a wallet to you." Her mouth opened, then closed again. I could see the gears turning in her head. She was realizing perhaps for the first time that my support had never been unconditional, that it wasn't an infinite resource, that it could be withdrawn just as easily as it had been given. The next few weeks were a slow unraveling. The luxuries she had taken for granted began to vanish one by one. She had to start cooking instead of ordering takeout. She had to check price tags before making purchases. The car she used for errands? Suddenly she had to contribute to its maintenance, and then the arguments started. They weren't loud, not yet, but they were tense. "I don't understand why you're acting like this," she said one night as we sat in the dim light of the living room. "You always handled everything before. Why change now?" "Because before I thought I was appreciated. Now I know better." She crossed her arms. "So this is some kind of punishment?" I exhaled sharply. "No, it's a correction." For the first time she looked genuinely worried. Not just annoyed, not just inconvenienced. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to understand. But understanding wasn't enough. The real question was, would she change? The shift was undeniable. She tried to ignore it at first, to brush it off as a temporary mood, a phase I would grow out of. But the days stretched into weeks, and my stance remained firm. I had stopped being the unquestioning provider, and she had started feeling the weight of reality. At first she resorted to subtle manipulation. She would sigh heavily when looking at an online shopping cart, glancing at me as if expecting me to cave. She started talking about how stressful her days were, how she just needed a little relief, thinly veiled attempts to coax me back into my old habits. But I wasn't biting. I simply nodded, offered a few neutral words of support, and carried on with my life. Then she tried bargaining. "I'll cut down on shopping if you start handling the bills again," she suggested one night at dinner, twirling her fork in her pasta, her tone light but her eyes watchful. I took a sip of my drink. "I think it's good for us to both be involved in the finances. That way we both understand the value of what we're spending." Her lips pressed into a thin line. It's always been easier when you took care of it." "Easier for who?" I asked calmly. She had no response for that. As time passed, she began to realize that my change was permanent. And with that realization came frustration. She snapped at small things, how I didn't rush to fix things around the house anymore, how I no longer planned elaborate date nights or gave in to her whims. "You're being petty," she accused one night, arms crossed. "I'm being fair," I corrected. "I spent years making sure you never had to worry about anything. Now I think it's time you see what that felt like for me." That was when the panic set in. She started taking on more responsibility, but not out of a sense of fairness, out of fear. She was afraid of what losing control over me meant. She started cooking more, paying attention to bills, making an effort to keep things running smoothly. But it wasn't enough. It never could be, because she wasn't doing it out of love or respect. She was doing it because she felt the ground beneath her shifting, and she was desperate to regain her footing. And I watched. Not with anger, not with glee, but with a quiet certainty. The tables had turned. The only question left was whether she would change, or if she would simply resent me for no longer playing my part in her perfect world. The tension in our home had become unbearable. The quiet glances, the stiff conversations, the forced politeness. It all felt like we were two strangers playing house. She had stopped asking me for money outright, but I could tell she resented the change. One evening, as I sat in the living room reading, she finally snapped. "I don't understand," she said, her voice a mixture of frustration and desperation. "Why are you doing this? Why are you acting like we're enemies?" I set my book down and looked at her, really looked at her. "I'm not your enemy," I said. "I just stopped playing the role you assigned me." She scoffed, folding her arms. "You're making this sound like some kind of conspiracy. All I ever wanted was for things to run smoothly." "No," I corrected. "You wanted things to run smoothly for you. You never considered what it was costing me." Her expression faltered. It was the first time I saw something other than irritation, something closer to guilt. "I never asked you to suffer," she whispered. I sighed, leaning back into my chair. "You never had to. You just assumed I would handle everything, and for years I did. But the moment I voiced how exhausted I was, you dismissed me, told me I was supposed to provide, not complain. That was the moment I realized you never saw me as a person with limits, just a resource." She shook her head. "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" I challenged. "Tell me, if I had never changed, would you have? Would you have ever stopped expecting me to handle everything?" Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. For the first time, she had no defense. No quick retort. No way to spin it. The realization sank in, slow and painful. Maybe she wasn't cruel. Maybe she wasn't manipulative in the way villains are in stories. Maybe she had simply been selfish in a way she never recognized. Until now. She swallowed hard. "I don't know." I nodded as if that answer was enough. Maybe it was, because for the first time I wasn't waiting for her to change. I was deciding if I even cared if she did. The weight of our conversation lingered in the air for days. She was quieter, more contemplative, as if finally confronting the truth she had refused to see. I noticed the way she hesitated before speaking, the way her eyes darted to me, as though searching for some sign that things could return to the way they were. But I had already accepted that they never would. One evening, as I prepared to leave for the gym, she finally spoke. "Can we talk?" Her voice was softer than I had heard in a long time. I paused, slinging my bag over my shoulder. "I'm listening," she swallowed, fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "I was wrong about everything. About you, about how I treated you, about how much I expected without giving anything back." She took a shaky breath. "I don't want to lose you, but I know I might have already." Her words should have moved me, but I felt strangely numb. Not because I didn't care, but because I had spent so long waiting for an acknowledgement that I no longer needed. "What changed?" I asked, my tone steady. "I started thinking about what life would be like if you weren't here, if I had to do it all alone." She exhaled, and it scared me. I sighed, shaking my head. "That's the problem. You're not afraid of losing me. You're afraid of losing the comfort I provided." Her eyes widened. "That's not, isn't it?" I interrupted. "You never saw me, not really. And now that you're facing the possibility of doing things on your own, you suddenly realized my worth?" She was silent, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. I had already made my decision. "I don't want an apology that's born out of fear," I said finally. "I wanted respect, and if you couldn't give it when I needed it most, I don't know if I can believe it now." Her breath hitched. "So that's it? We're done?" I didn't answer right away, because the truth was I didn't know. "I need time," I said, "and I think you do too." I left without another word, knowing that whatever came next, it would be on my terms. The days stretched into weeks, and in that time I embraced the quiet, no longer shackled to expectations that had drained me. I focused on myself, on rebuilding, on rediscovering the person I had been before I became just a provider. I spent more time at the gym, invested in hobbies I had long abandoned, and reconnected with friends I had neglected over the years. There was something liberating about making decisions that served only me, about not feeling the pressure to uphold a role I no longer believed in. She reached out a few times, a text here, a call there. Each time her words were softer, her tone more subdued. But I wasn't in a hurry to respond. I needed space to see if her change was real, or if it was merely the fear of losing comfort masquerading as regret. One evening, weeks after our last conversation, she knocked on my door. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what I would find on the other side. When I did, she stood there looking different, not physically, but in the way she carried herself, less entitled, more vulnerable. "I'd been thinking a lot," she admitted, clasping her hands together, "about everything, about how I took you for granted, about how unfair I was to you, and I don't want to be that person anymore." I studied her for a long moment. "And what if you can't change? What if it's just guilt talking?" She exhaled sharply. "Then I'll prove to you that it isn't. But I don't expect you to just believe me. I want to try. And if you don't want that, I'll understand." For the first time, she wasn't demanding. She wasn't assuming that I would fall back into old patterns. And that, more than anything, made me pause. Maybe she had truly realized something. Maybe she hadn't. But the difference now was that I knew my worth. I knew what I was willing to accept and what I wasn't. I stepped aside, holding the door open, just slightly. "Let's start with a conversation. No promises, just honesty." She nodded, stepping inside. And just like that, a new beginning unfolded. Not dictated by obligation or expectation, but by choice. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. See you soon.